And one perspective that is even more rarely heard is the perspective of a physician that is serving donor families. So we're very thankful to have our next speaker coming to us from the Division of Critical Care Medicine at Children's National Hospital. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Dr. Matthew Sharron.
Good morning. One of the speakers this morning said that we should be humble, and I'd just like to make sure I don't forget to say this. I'm humbled by the stories that people have shared today, which are profound just as a start. So let me make sure I know how to do this. This is my disclosure slide. I have no financial relationships or conflicts of interest to disclose. I do want to disclose critical care is a team sport. And I am one member of that team. Most of what I'm going to be talking and sharing with you guys are quotes and thoughts from other members of the team, specifically the phenomenal nursing staff that I work with, as well as some of the social workers. So I also wanted to make sure I didn't forget to say that. So all talks are supposed to have objectives. So my objectives: to describe the unique aspects of pediatric organ donation, to explain our approach to the ask, and we'll kind of talk about how pediatric organ donation is a little bit different in that there usually is an ask involved. And then also I hope to touch on mostly the benefit of organ donation as I and the member of our critical care team see as the benefits that can provide to both families, donor families, as well as healthcare providers. Generally, background: children aren't donating organs in living organ donor donation. They may be receiving organs from this, but they're not usually taking part as donors, as living donors. And so the talk is going to focus on our collective experience with deceased donor organ transplantation, either by brain death or by donation after circulatory determination of death. Just for me to get a sense, when I was putting this talk together, my perception was I'm going to be speaking to mostly adult providers. Is that fair? Who in the room actually takes care of children? Okay, so it's, I don't know what percentage that is, but it's a low number. Okay. So for the people who take care of children, this is probably things that are already obvious to you. For other people, these things may not necessarily be as obvious. So children don't drive, right? Why am I bringing this up? That's pretty obvious, right? Okay. Well, if you don't drive, you don't have a driver's license. And so you have no first-person consent. On my driver's license, it says that I'm an organ donor. If I get something terrible happens to me, I have already put out there a legally binding agreement that I'm willing to donate my organs. I've considered that. In children, since the vast majority of them do not have driver's licenses, they have not either considered that, or even if they're, say, 16 and they've considered that, there is still a consent process that takes place with their family. Another unique thing in pediatrics, for many parents, having a child is a defining moment. As the parent of 2 sons, I can certainly speak to this. Our children often inspire us to be better people. They serve as a legacy of us moving forward. We really have hopes and aspirations for them. There's an African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. Anyone who takes care of children recognizes that you interact with that village sometimes. And it's the whole village. It is not just the mom and dad, it's aunts and uncles and teachers and friends. This picture that I have here, though it's from West Africa, I feel like I've been in a situation talking to a group like this, sans the tree and the villages in the back. So when we interact with families, there are often different racial and cultural and sometimes unspoken hierarchies within families that are very important to understand as you approach families and as they consider whether they want to give the ultimate gift of allowing their child to serve as a potential organ donor. So, to that end, we approach people with an ask. We do this in conjunction with Washington Regional Transplant Community, and we really owe it to families to approach them in a thoughtful, planned out, coordinated way. And the reason I think that's so important is they're considering giving you possibly the greatest thing that they've ever produced. And they're doing it at a time when they're at their probably greatest point of vulnerability. Because if you've met an ICU doctor, generally something terrible has happened. And if they're talking to you about the potential of your child being an organ donor, something even more terrible has happened. So to that end, we very much plan and think about the quote-unquote ask. So we have process mapped this over time. We have a pre-ask huddle where we really, with our social workers, try to define who the decision makers, more sometimes or others, in a family are. We try to identify who has a relationship with that family and who's going to perform this ask. The reason to do that is multiple. One, and I think foremost, you want to make sure that in this time, which is terrible for a family, you do your best job at giving them all of the options that they're going to have. If that family chooses to allow their child to be an organ donor, it has the added benefit that many people can benefit from that. But it also has the benefit in that I, as somebody who's taken care of many, many children who have died, sometimes have the foresight before families do to understand that they will actually benefit from that gift as well. And those benefits are not as direct as sometimes people have shared in the last two talks, where there's a whole bereavement process for Washington Regional Transplant Community, but it's indirect. It's the value people get from sharing something that was valuable to them. So benefits that are likely obvious after organ donation. Well, one organ donor can save up to 8 lives. This has been already said today. They can affect countless more. So you can have tissue donors, you can have eye donors, but you can also have direct and indirect benefits. The indirect benefits are the benefits to the family that gives away and sees their child live on in someone else. Things that might not be as obvious are these benefits to the donor family, as well as benefits to the hospital staff and healthcare providers. And so I'm going to share some quotes with you that are not my quotes. They're sometimes paraphrasing of things that have been said to me as a critical care doctor, but a lot of them are things that have been shared by our social workers and our critical care nurses. And I want to say something. My little sister's a nurse. She shared with me many years ago something that she thought of, but I kind of knew, but I had never really put into words before. When you lay hands on someone, that's a very profound thing. And when you lay hands on someone else's child, that's an even more profound thing. As a physician, I may go into a room 3, 4, 5 times over a 12-hour shift. The critical care nurses, many of who I work with are right over here, they'll spend 12 hours in that room laying hands on a child that entire time. That's a profound thing. You develop those short-term, intense relationships with people in that time period. And so I wanted to give you that context because I'm going to share some of the things that have been said to me next. So organ donors' families will go through a grieving stage. This is well described. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. But these don't evolve linearly. And not everyone is in the same place at the same time. So whereas one family member may be bargaining, another may be depressed, another may be angry. The benefits to families related to organ donation also are going to evolve over time. So these are quotes from families that were shared with us in the short term. I took care of this first child, and so this was actually said to me by the mother of a teenager who had died in a traumatic event. And so she said, my child was generous. He was always sharing, he was always helping others, he was always giving of himself. This is what he would have wanted. This was shared with one of our social workers. My child has always been my hero, and now more than ever they are for helping someone else. The last quote is I've seen in multiple different iterations at multiple different times, but seems to be almost universal amongst families who choose to allow their loved one's organs to be shared with other families, is at least something good or something positive will come out of something that is terrible or is horrible. Long term, there is an evolution process, and I think people end up in different places, but there is still great benefit for families who can see value in some event that they never would have chosen to take part in. So this is actually a quote from a mother whose picture was up on one of the last two speakers ago. And so this was a woman who lost her daughter when she was under a year of age, and she was quoted about 2 to 3 years later. And I think these quotes are particularly profound for me. So we couldn't do a lot of things, but what we could do was try to honor her the best way we could. And we felt that her being generous and trying to help someone else was a nice way to honor and remember her. That same mom goes on then to say, what we've come to realize, and this is now separated by, I think, 2.5 years, is there's a baton passing that we didn't fully appreciate or respect at the time when they made their decision. And we made our decision, we said goodbye, and then we went home. But for someone else, a totally other story began. And so when she was telling the story, it was in relation to her daughter who had died at under a year of age and the little boy who had received her heart. And that little boy was now 4 and doing very, very well. Healthcare providers and organ donation. So also not as directly obvious, but I think there are important things to share here. So this was a quote given to me by one of the pediatric ICU nurses I've worked with for the last 12 years, who I was actually on call with on Tuesday night. And she said, "We are the familiar strangers in the very intimate moments of a family's life-altering events." And then another one of her nursing colleagues passed on, "It's both an honor and a privilege to have a family, often in their most vulnerable moment, put their trust in us. And with this honor comes the responsibility to do what is best for that family moving forward." And then she kind of hedged the last thing she said, but so I'm going to share with you. She said, this sounds a little paternalistic, but I assure you it's not. And I can assure you, knowing the person who said it, it's not at all. She said, "We have the experience of sometimes seeing or understanding that a family would benefit from giving the gift of donation before they do. Only just in so much as what you do, having seen children die, and having seen children die repeatedly, often you can anticipate the value in something maybe in a different way than someone who is undergoing this severe traumatic event." And so this is a quote finally from one of our social workers, "Every family, every time." And what this refers to is we often, even though I've now for the last 10 minutes told you about how I work in a field where we see bad things happen and we're used to trauma of families, we're still humans. We still feel for people. And I think there's sometimes a hesitation to approach families, particularly at traumatic times, because there's this concern that maybe we're overburdening them. Maybe this is a conversation they're not ready to have. And so every family, every time, I think really means that it is on us to share opportunities with families by not approaching them and by not coming to them with a thoughtful approach on the opportunity that they now unfortunately have the opportunity to give. We are doing that family a disservice. And so I want to close with, this is also a quote from one of our social workers, Gail Gilmore. "Donation is an extraordinary act of altruism at a time of intense tragedy. When we empower families in every way we can, consent becomes their decision, and the healing power of that decision to consent is maximized." I think that's my last slide. This is the Donate Life flag, which is outside Children's National. And with that, I thank you for your time.